Okay, here we are with part 2 of the pictures PowerPoint, talking about concepts and terminology as they apply to visual art, two-dimensional art. What do you think of this? I'll give you a couple of seconds. Alright, now as we've already talked about, one of the first things that happens when we encounter an artwork is we try to identify the elements. What are we dealing with? What are we looking at? And then the next thing we need to do is to start applying our concepts and terminology and things of that nature to it to see how we might be able to access it or receive some communication from it or whatever the case may be. So now, as we look at this, let's just go down the same road that we've been going. Would you consider this consonant or dissonant? Pretty sure most people would say dissonant. What about tension or release? Does this give you a feeling of motion or a feeling of stillness? I think most people would say it gives you a feeling of motion. What about concrete or abstract? I think most people would agree that this is more on the abstract side. Okay. What about, would you consider this open or closed composition? Does it lead your eye outside of the painting or does it keep your eye inside the painting? A lot of people might say at first glance that this tends to lead you outside because of just everything going everywhere. But if you take a few seconds to observe a little further, you'll notice that towards the edges of the painting that the activity thins out. So that would be a very good argument for this being a closed composition, that the activity is inside the frame and not leading you outside of the frame. Now, we've already talked about the fact that when you consider an artwork that you have to consider the time period and the audience and the mindset and all of those things of the artist and that artist's world, when and where and why he created that artwork. Another thing that you have to consider when you see art that's not in its original form, because obviously this painting was not originally a slide in a PowerPoint presentation, but it was a painting. Well, this painting is approximately 8 feet wide by 5 feet tall. That would be about the size of a wall in a small bedroom. Wouldn't be as tall as that wall because this is going to be 8 feet tall, but it's about the size of the wall, at least as wide as a wall in a small bedroom. Imagine what that looks like when you come up on a painting that's this busy and that big. Another thing that would give you some perspective, and you would have to know a little bit more about Jackson Pollock, who is the painter of this, the artist who painted this painting. The technique that he used for this, and I invite you to Google him or YouTube search him or something like that, but the guy that painted this, the way he would paint is he would use something that's about the size of a paint stirrer like you get at Home Depot, you know, that stick kind of thing, like a large ruler. And he would hold the bucket and he would dip in with this piece of wood, and then he would sling the paint on the canvas, and the canvas would be on the floor. So he would actually stand above on the canvas and do this painting. Now, the first thing that you might think about is, what about footprints and things of that nature? Well, that tells you the type of control that he would have had to have. Now, you're probably saying, what control could you possibly be talking about? Well, check this out. Not too long after he painted this and the other paintings that were in this series of paintings in this style, a lot of people kind of said the same thing that you might think they would say, that, oh, he's just slinging paint out there. I can do that. Well, he started to paint paintings with the same technique, using the stick, slinging the paint directly out of the bucket, and he would do that, and he would actually make faces and things that you could recognize, just to show that he has control over the technique, that even though it is an unorthodox technique, he has control over it, and things are going, the paint is going exactly where he wants it to go, and all those kinds of things. So this is Jackson Pollock, and as you can see, the name of this painting is Number One. The name of the painting is Number One. It was painted in 1948. Okay, so there's other paintings in this series. Here's another observation about this particular painting, and other paintings in the series as well, but especially about this one. There's a lot of activity. When you have so much activity, it's almost as if it makes everything stand still. If you understand what I'm saying, it's kind of like when you mix all the colors, you get white. And it's kind of the same thing here. If you can get that feeling that there's so much going on that it's like you really just can't go anywhere. You know, you can follow this line, you follow that line, it's just nowhere to go. And interesting also, the word static. When we think of static, a lot of times we think of what you see on a television when the station doesn't come in, or you probably wouldn't remember that because you all probably all have cable and never had regular broadcast TV. But those of you that have, or if you remember that, when a station didn't come in all the way or something like that, and you get this, what some people call white noise or static. Or when you're listening to the radio and you're in between stations and you call it static. Well, a lot of times we think of static as a whole lot of motion, but the word static actually means that it's not moving at all. And when I look at this painting, I kind of get that feeling of static. There's so much going on that there's nothing going on. You know, that there's nothing moving. So much stuff is moving that it seems like nothing is moving. Another thought that I just had looking at this is if you've seen the commercials where, I think it's for DirecTV, that allows you to pause the action in one room, you know, to go to another. That's the kind of feeling that I get from this painting, that this is just like a moment in time that's just frozen for us, a moment of chaos possibly that's just frozen. So anyway, those are just some observations. And again, I want you to think about what the aesthetic distance would do when, if you were to see this painting up close, considering that it's about 8 feet by 5 or 6 feet tall. Okay? All right. Okay. Let's look at this one. The Persistence of Memory. This is by Salvador Dali. Let's go. Consonant or dissonant? Well, there's a few things to be said about that on this particular painting. When we think of consonance and dissonance, of course, the definition is relatively harsh or relatively easy on the senses. From a compositional standpoint, if you look at the colors, if you look at the fact that a lot of the shapes are smooth and flowing and things of that nature, it may give you a consonant feeling. However, the subject matter may be a little bit dissonant if things out of place bother you. You know, like the fact that those obviously solid objects are wilting and melting, right? So dissonance isn't always going to be, consonance or dissonance isn't always going to be an all-encompassing term where you can just say, oh, it's this or it's that. There's reasons that you might say this, and some aspects of it may be this, and some aspects of it may be the other. Let's talk about abstract and concrete. Again, one could say that this is concrete from a standpoint that just about every object you're looking at you can recognize and identify and associate with and access relatively easy and associate it with, you know, a previous frame of reference. However, abstract from a standpoint that, again, watches don't tend to melt like that. Okay? Tension or release. Well, again, you can have some conflicting views. I definitely could see an idea of release simply because everything seems like it just kind of drooped to a stop. You know, it's kind of like a hot day. It's just everything's just kind of still. But again, if you're somebody that it bothers you for things to be out of place or things to not be the way that they're supposed to be, the different structures and things that don't jibe with the laws of natural science and all that kind of thing might cause you to get a good deal of tension from this painting. What about open or closed composition? You could probably argue either way. At the end of the day, I would probably call this open, because when I look at the mountains, the mountain range over there in the upper right hand corner, I get a feeling of open, like what's outside the frame. When I look to the left and I see how everything is kind of cut off at the edge of the frame of the painting, again, I get a feeling of open composition. Now, another place that I get a big feeling of open composition is the shadow. If you look at the ground, the primary part of the ground is covered by a shadow. And for me, my question is, what's causing the shadow? Which again leads my attention outside of the frame. Now here's another thing about the arts. Because we are able to manipulate what we're showing, what we're focusing on, and things like that, a lot of times we can do things that aren't quite natural or aren't quite right, and the recipient of the art, the person that's experiencing the art, may or may not notice them. Now, of course, in this case, when we look at the watches, of course, that's obviously not right. But let's look at that shadow for a second. We see shadow covering the entire part of the ground, but yet there's some places where we should see shadow that we don't. Whatever that is in the middle of the frame that that watch on the ground is draped over, that's not in shadow, but it seems like it should be if everything else is. Also, if you look at the structure that the watch over to the side is draped along, that seems like it should have a little bit more shadow, considering where it looks like the shadow is coming from. And you could actually argue as to whether the shadow is being cast from the lower right or from the lower left. There's a few different ways you could look at that. But my point is that the artist manipulated what would seem to be natural and kind of allows you to see things you wouldn't ordinarily see. Another example of that, if you're ever watching TV, especially if you're watching soap operas or something like that, just kind of look and you'll notice in a lot of soap operas there is no shadow. Or you'll notice in some shows that somebody's in a house. They might be in a living room and there's windows on two sides and the sun seems to be shining in both sides, which helps them light the scene and helps you see what's going on in there, but that's just not natural. You know, we only have one sun in our solar system. So, all right. Now, let's look at these ants over here on that pocket watch that's in the lower left-hand corner. What do those say to you? Oh, speaking of which, what does it say to you that there's a tree growing out of a table, or what looks like a table? See, again, we're looking at some things that just don't seem right. That whole square structure right there looks like it's something natural, but obviously isn't natural, because we know that nature doesn't have corners like that and edges like that. And if you look a little bit further up, you have that thing that looks like glass, like a glass platform or something like that, and that doesn't, it looks like it's something natural, like it's part of the landscape, but obviously that's not normal either for those things to be squared off and to have those particular angles. All right. Also, if you look at the mountains over there, you know, can't quite tell where the shadow is supposed to be or whether it's where it's supposed to be, and everything has a surreal, dreamlike quality. And all this has been being manipulated by the artist. Persistence of memory, for me, when I think of time, I think of memory. When I think of ants, I think of persistence. But what I found out actually is that for Salvador Dali, those ants often represent death. What about that thing that's in the middle of the painting? A lot of people have tried to figure out what that is. What I see is it looks like a piece of somebody's face that was kind of peeled off and just kind of thrown there. In other words, what I'm looking at is an eyelash on a closed eye, and the rest of that is skin. That's one way of looking at it. Some people have said that they thought that that was an eyebrow. Okay? But there's a lot to look at here, and obviously you would need to know more about the artist and what his mindset was and what exactly he was trying to say, you know, to figure this out. This painting is not that large, by the way. It's not as large as the Pollock paintings. All right, something to think about. Let's go on.